The previous two lectures looked at one central response to the problem of free will, libertarianism. Libertarians maintain that we have free will and it's inconsistent with determinism. So free will requires that determinism is false, but fortunately for us, determinism is false. For the next two lectures, we'll look at a very different reaction to the problem of free will. It's known as compatibilism, and on this view, free will and compatibilism are entirely consistent. There's no kind of conflict between them at all. People who reject this view, people who reject compatibilism, are called, obviously, incompatibilists. Since this is such an important distinction in the free will debate, I want to set it out in a couple of different ways. So one way to think about it is that people who think that free will is compatible with determinism are on one side of a tree, and people who think that it's incompatible with determinism are on the other side of the tree. And once you answer that question, is it compatible or not, then you get a further question. So if you say it's compatible, then everything is fine, we have free will, determinism doesn't matter. If you say free will and determinism are incompatible, then you have a further question, which is, well, is determinism true? And libertarians say incompatibilism is the right branch and determinism is false. Hard determinists, who we'll look at in two lectures hence, maintain that incompatibilism is true, but determinism is true, so we don't have free will. Another way to understand the distinction between incompatibilism and compatibilism is to think about the earlier distinction I drew between descriptive and substantive questions. So descriptive questions ask, what is our concept of free will like? What does it require? And on this descriptive question, compatibilists maintain that what our concept of free will requires is nothing very demanding like anything about whether determinism is true or false. That just doesn't matter for our everyday concept of free will. Whereas incompatibilists maintain that, in fact, what's required for free will is that determinism is false. So compatibilists tend to say that incompatibilists are just confused. They have a confused notion of free will, and that's one of the core problems in the literature. The first known advocate of this view, that free will and determinism are compatible, once again is a Greek. It's the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus, who lived from about 280 BCE to 206 BCE. But more sophisticated accounts emerged in the modern era, and even more sophisticated accounts emerged in the 20th century. And in contemporary philosophy, compatibilism continues to be a widely adopted approach to the problem of free will, perhaps the most widely adopted approach. At least many philosophers think that free will ultimately is compatible with determinism. And so this really turns out to be a powerful theory that philosophers are attracted to. As we saw in Lecture 4, the Stoics embraced a deterministic picture of the world. So they thought that everything that happened was caused by what happened before. But the Stoics continued to maintain that people were responsible. So Chrysippus acknowledges that people aren't exempt from the causal order. They don't stand outside of the causal order. But he maintains that our own characters play a critical role in how the causal order unfolds. And that, he thinks, is what really matters for issues about responsibility. He provides a telling example here. He says, suppose you throw a cylindrical stone down a hill. You, of course, are the immediate cause of the downward movement. But the stone continues to roll down the hill. As one Stoic says, the rock is still going down the hill, but it's, quote, not because you are still throwing it. For some reason, that conjures up a funny image in my mind. But in any case, the point is that the rock keeps rolling down the hill because of the nature of the rock, in particular, its weight and shape. So a cylindrical stone is the kind of thing that will continue rolling down the hill because of its nature. Contrast this with, say, a slab of rock, where if you try to throw a slab of rock down the hill, it's not going to keep rolling down the hill. Or a leaf. If you try to throw a leaf down the hill, something similar will happen. It will stop much earlier than it would if it had been a cylindrical stone. Similarly, Chrysippus says, our actions are generated out of necessity, that they follow from whatever the causal order dictates. But he says, just as the nature of the stone contributes to its outcome, namely rolling down the hill, so too, he says, our nature, our character contributes to the outcome, which is our action. The contribution of our character, he says, doesn't have any indeterminacy in it. There's no indeterminist element in the generation of our behavior. As people who accept libertarianism thought, they thought that part of what's involved in making a decision is this indeterminist element. Chrysippus rejects all of that. He says the character of a person directs the outcome in a causally predictable way, just as the character of the stone directs its outcome tumbling down the hill. Now, Chrysippus has a particular view about how the process is supposed to work. What he says is that, first of all, my perception of a situation, like let's say I see a person in distress, that can act as the trigger of my action. And that's like the initial push on the stone. But then my character responds to that perception. If my character is good, then my response is likely to be good. If my character is bad, the response will be bad. So if my character is good, my action when I perceive the person in distress will be to help the person in distress. If my character is bad, maybe my action will be to point at them and laugh. Either way, though, my response is controlled by my character. So on this view, even though all actions are fated, they're nonetheless special. So they're fated in the sense that they're inevitable products of the causal order. But they're special, they're not to be equated with mere physical events because they involve something distinctive. They involve moral character. That isn't involved in the stone rolling down the hill. So Chrysippus goes on to emphasize that different people respond differently to the same situation. A person with a bad character responds in a bad way, whereas someone with a good character responds in a good way. Still, he says, a person is responsible for his actions. A bad person will be responsible for his bad action, a good person responsible for his good action. Unlike the libertarians, Chrysippus is not even suggesting that a bad person could combat his character and do something else. He's not saying that a bad person could step back and say, no, I resist my strongest impulse to do bad things. He doesn't think people can do that. That isn't what he's talking about. He's not concerned with that. Nor does he think that after a person performs his action, you could say that the person could have done something else. He thinks that the person will do whatever his character directs him to do. However, since it's my character that does the work, Chrysippus says, that means the behavior is up to me. I'm the one. It's not something that's sort of extraneous for me. It's not something outside of me. I am the source of the action. So he says, you can't blame the action. Let's say I see the distressed person and I point and laugh at them. He says, you can't blame that on the environment. It has to be blamed on the person because it flows from his character. And one of the reasons we know that it flows from his character, he would say, is precisely because different people respond differently to the same situation. And what we should do when we hold people responsible is hold their character responsible. Does he have a good character or a bad character? In one sense, this is like the agent-causal theories of the previous lecture, in that it focuses on the self as the responsible agent. But there's a vital difference. According to the Stoics, the self is not something separate from character. The self is not something that stands apart from character. The self is just the totality of a person's character, their beliefs, desires, aspirations, emotions. That's what makes a person. So we already see with Chrysippus an important compatibilist point that continues to bear on philosophical discussions. According to compatibilists, much of the free will debate rests on a confusion. It is true that our actions are not free when something forces us to act in some way. That's something compatibilists maintain. External constraint undercuts our freedom. So if somebody pushes me and I end up knocking somebody over and they get hurt, I can't be held responsible for that. And compatibilists say, of course not. You can't hold somebody responsible for something like that. Being pushed to do something from the outside is very different from an action that flows from your character, an action that comes from the inside. And what Chrysippus and later compatibilists claim is that once we recognize this distinction between external compulsion and internal compulsion, our concerns about determinism threatening free will should just evaporate. We shouldn't worry about those anymore. During the 17th and 18th century of philosophy, a new approach emerged for compatibilists, starting with the distinguished English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. But it was embraced and elaborated by many other eminent philosophers, David Hume, John Stuart Mill, and their broad approach has come to be known as classical compatibilism. The basic strategy for compatibilism that they offer in this era has two stages. First of all, the compatibilist argues that the considerations that are offered to show that free will is inconsistent with determinism are somehow confused, that the arguments that free will is incompatible with determinism are confused. In addition, though, the compatibilist wants to say, well, this is what free will really is. And once they explain that, they'll say, and you see how this is perfectly consistent with determinism being true. Compatibilists have offered many reasons why they think it's a confusion to think free will is incompatible with determinism. And one central argument that's suggested by Hobbes is that libertarianism is just incoherent. And this is supposed to be revealed by what got called the libertarian dilemma. On the one hand, libertarians say that an agent's decision isn't free if the decision is determined. But on the other hand, if the decision isn't determined, then it doesn't seem like it's determined by the agent either. And that, people like Hobbes maintain, that just leaves the libertarian out of any intelligible options. Horn 1 of the dilemma is to accept that actions really are determined. Horn 2 is to accept that the action is undetermined, but then that seems to edge back toward the action being random. And this is very much akin to the worry that we were left with in the last lecture. So it's unclear how to give a satisfying account of how an agent makes a decision if it's neither determined nor random. The compatibilist, like Hobbes, takes this to teach us a vital lesson about free will. Since the libertarian view of free will makes no sense, he says, it can't be the relevant notion of free will. David Hume offers a different kind of argument aimed at showing a deep confusion in incompatibilism. He claims that the whole matter is just a verbal dispute because he says everybody accepts both determinism and free will. Of course, we accept that people act freely, as indicated by the fact that we hold them responsible for their actions. So Hume gets a free pass on the idea that people think that we're free and responsible. But he also maintains that people think that determinism is true. And this might sound like a surprising claim. Hume thought that both philosophers and pretty much everybody else accept determinism. We accept it about material things, he thought, but he also thought that we accept it when it comes to actions. And he writes, "It is universally acknowledged that there is a great uniformity among the actions of men in all nations and ages, and that human nature remains still the same in its principles and operations. The same motives always produce the same actions." And Hume here mentions jealousy, self-interest, and greed, and he says we all know that these motives produce predictable actions. Now, it's not clear that Hume's particular examples here are all that convincing. After all, the libertarian also thinks that motives provide important information for predicting behavior. But the libertarian still maintains that some of the things that happen are unpredictable, and some of that requires appeal to free will. Still, I think there's something to Hume's claim. As we've seen in earlier lectures, determinism really does seem to have some sway with common sense. It's a really compelling doctrine. When I teach free will in Introduction to Philosophy, I often try to bring this out before I ever tell the students that the particular class period is about free will and determinism. I sneak up on them to see if I can get their relatively untainted views. So I'll start off the class by providing an example of two universes that are exactly the same. This is the kind of example I talked about in a previous lecture. In this case, let's say we imagine there are two boys. There's John and his twin. And both of them are trying to decide whether or not to join the Boy Scouts. So they live in these two different universes, but they are exactly the same up until this point. Everything they think, want, hope, and so on is exactly the same. So if one of them likes to swim, so does the other. If one of them hates broccoli just this much, the other one hates broccoli exactly that same amount. If they each want all the same things and think all the same things, I ask the students, is it possible that one of them will choose to join the Boy Scouts and one will choose not to join? When I present this, I find that most students say it's not possible for one boy to make a different choice than the other. Now, that would be explained by the idea that the students implicitly accept determinism. They implicitly accept that if everything is exactly the same up until that point, then they have to make the same decision. They can't diverge. Interestingly, though, there are often a few students who say it is possible for one boy to choose differently than the other. So I ask for elaboration. I'll say, well, how would that happen? And the response is typically something like, well, maybe John likes the Boy Scouts a little bit more than twin John. Of course, that fails to abide by the conditions of the thought experiment. It was stipulated that they wanted things exactly the same amount. But what's more interesting is that that explanation seems to reveal an assumption that in order for John and his twin to decide differently, there must be some psychological difference between them. So maybe Hume is right that people accept determinism. But let's go back to his argument. Remember, his argument is that incompatibilism is wrong. Incompatibilism is the wrong view because everybody accepts both free will and determinism. But that argument seems to depend on the dubious assumption that if common sense agrees to two claims, then those two claims can't be inconsistent. They have to be consistent if everybody agrees. But this doesn't seem like a very persuasive argument. It seems to ignore many cases where people fail to notice tensions between their beliefs. As I suggested in the first lecture, philosophy is often in the business of uncovering unnoticed tensions in our beliefs. This seems to be what we find in the problem of evil, the problem of reconciling the belief that God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing with the belief that there's suffering in the world. It would be an excessively easy kind of philosophy that said, well, people believe both of those things, so there can't be any problem here. If that was a good strategy in philosophy, we could have closed up shop ages ago. Hume follows this, though, with, I think, a much more forceful and interesting argument. He says that the incompatibilist view gets things exactly backwards. He says, we wouldn't hold someone responsible if their actions didn't flow from their character. He says, if an action doesn't come, quote, from some cause in the character and disposition of the person, he says, then that action can't redound to his honor if good, nor infamy if evil. And Hume's point is that we hold people morally responsible precisely when their actions are consonant with their characters, not when their actions are completely apart from their characters, when they diverge radically from their characters. To see the point, consider the difference between someone who murders as a result of premeditation. After years of planning, they carefully work out how to kill someone without getting caught. They carry through on their plan to the last detail. And compare that with somebody who murders out of a moment of insanity. We regard the premeditator as more deeply culpable, Hume would say, precisely because the action flows from deep within his character. Hume thinks that that's because we recognize that the bad action reflects a stable feature of the person's character. And of course, the law in our society does punish premeditated crime more harshly than crimes that happen in an act of insane passion or something. So Hume has some kind of foundation here in common sense, it seems. If we found out that a person's action was completely uncaused, for example, because of, let's say, a random swerve in their brain, that wouldn't give us reason to hold them especially responsible, he says. On the contrary, it would be ample reason to declare them not responsible at all for the action. So those are some of the arguments for why incompatibilism is supposed to rest on a confusion. But even if you accept those arguments, the compatibilist is really only halfway there. For he still needs to explain what free will is, if it isn't something that defies determinism. Classical compatibilists thus need to provide an account of free will. But before we get to that, before we get to their account of free will, I want to say something about how compatibilists thought about decision-making or choice. Because the idea that people make decisions seems like it's something that we want to be able to accommodate. And one important plank of compatibilism is that, yes, people do make decisions, but they think the way decision-making works is perfectly consistent with determinism. So Hobbes thought of choice or decision as follows. He thought a person is like a scale. The weights on the scale are things like what a person wants and the means by which he might get what he wants. These weights are also affected by things like considerations of convenience. So let's say I want to go to a movie, but I also want to go to a concert the same night. The movie is closer, but the concert is only happening tonight. But the concert starts after my bedtime, but I really love the band. These considerations get weighed against each other on the scale, says Hobbes. When the scale tips, say, towards going to the concert, that constitutes my choice. That's the model of choice that Hobbes thinks we should adopt. Now, in contemporary psychology, decision is often construed in somewhat similar terms, that you weigh options against costs, risks, and so forth. And like other accounts of weighing different amounts, this weighing process is entirely consistent with determinism. So just as determinism doesn't preclude the possibility of a scale that works with, say, fruit, neither does it preclude a scale working with the costs and benefits represented in the brain of a person, or an animal for that matter. This model of choice as weighing seems like it can be extended into a general model of decision-making for all mammals. The account of decision-making that I've just suggested can also be adopted by people who don't believe compatibilism. Maybe you think that free will requires that determinism is false, but you might still think that Hobbes pretty much got the model of decision-making right. For instance, a hard determinist might think that the model of decision-making that Hobbes offers is the correct one, and that is exactly why we know that we don't have free will. So this model of decision-making can be adopted by a wide range of people. In fact, it has been. This is a pretty common way of thinking about decision-making. But in the case of the compatibilists, this model is especially important because they don't want to be in the position of having to give up the view that people make choices, that people make decisions. Now, that's the setup for the background to the compatibilist theory. So they can accommodate the fact that decisions happen, people make decisions. Now they need to try to give an account of what free will really is. So what compatibilists maintain is that what free will really is has nothing to do with indeterminism. Rather, free will is primarily about the absence of external constraint on one's behavior. Libertarians make a big fuss about the idea that one could have done otherwise as being essential to free will. So they say an action only counts as free if the agent could have done something else. Classical compatibilists had a proposal about how to keep this language, the could have done otherwise language, without the libertarian theory. And what they said was, when I say I could have done otherwise, all that means is that there was nothing preventing me. There was no constraint that kept me from doing something else. So one prominent version of the theory says the following: an action counts as free when the person could have done otherwise if he had so desired. So let's just take the simple example of me deciding whether or not to move my hand. Now let's say I don't move my hand. Still, the compatibilist says, that was a free action. So long as I wasn't restrained from moving my hand, then it was free. And in fact, I wasn't restrained from moving my hand, so that counts as a free action. There was nothing getting in the way of me moving my hand, and if I'd wanted to move my hand, I probably would have. Now this account is consistent with determinism. And to see why, let's consider a somewhat simplified version of the theory. So let's just take this simple, this takes off some of the bells and whistles, but let's say my action is free when it is caused by my desires. So I'm free if I get to do what I want, that nothing stands in the way of me getting what I want. Now, on that model, it doesn't matter, according to the classical compatibilists, that my desires themselves were causally determined by factors outside of my control. The only important consideration is whether I was constrained to behave in a certain way. So when I behave, sometimes those behaviors are caused by somebody pushing me, and sometimes they're caused by a chain of reasoning or deciding within me. In both cases, the whole shebang is determined, according to compatibilists. But they say there's an important difference nonetheless. In the case of me being pushed, I'm not free, but in the case in which my behavior is caused by what I want, I am free. Hume says that this freedom is possessed by, quote, everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains. Let me reiterate that this is consistent with determinism because he's just saying that freedom consists in the absence of external constraints. So let's go back to the idea that when I make decisions, my mind just mechanically weighs the costs and benefits of various options. This can be an entirely deterministic process, but my action is free just so long as that process proceeds in a way that is free of external constraints. Classical compatibilism, even though it has this very rosy picture, faces a number of important objections. One objection is that this view doesn't distinguish humans and any other animals. Dogs and cats and toads are often able to carry out their desires without being compelled or constrained. Yet, it has seemed to many philosophers that these creatures lack some key ingredient for moral responsibility. Classical compatibilism doesn't have the resources to explain what that is. So it seems like dogs and cats and rats and toads have free will. But if they have free will, then they're morally responsible for their actions. But I don't know how anthropomorphic we should get about animals, but that seems excessive. So let's say that the cat wanted the meat that was on the counter, and it jumped up and knocked the plate onto the floor. If the cat had wanted the plate to stay on the table, then she probably would have left it there. That means that, according to the compatibilist account, the cat exercised free will in knocking the plate over. And yet, no matter how frustrated I might get at my cat, I never think that she is a morally responsible agent deserving blame for her misdeeds. I don't think she has the resources, I don't think she has the kind of free will to count as morally responsible. Another objection to the compatibilist account suggests that the account will sometimes say that an action wasn't free when it really was. Recall that the account says that an action is free when the person could have done something else if he had so desired. So imagine someone is in their apartment watching a rerun of Seinfeld and they hear screaming outside. He thinks, let's see, should I stay inside or go check to see whether somebody needs help? Oh, I guess I'll stay inside. Now, unbeknownst to the Seinfeld fan, the room was barricaded shut, so he couldn't possibly have left. We still want to say that he stayed in the room of his own free will. Indeed, we still want to hold him morally responsible for his callousness. But according to the compatibilist account above, his staying in the room wasn't free, for if he had wanted to leave, he could not have done so. The final objection to compatibilism, classical compatibilism, is that in some cases, people are able to do what they want, even though we think that their freedom is clearly compromised. In cases of compulsion, for instance, a person does what they want to do, but we often regard them as having diminished freedom and responsibility. So consider a kleptomaniac, someone with a strong compulsion to steal things. The kleptomaniac wants to steal a necklace, and she does steal it. But we don't think of her as being completely free, even though she meets whatever the classical compatibilist requires for doing what you want, and if you hadn't wanted it, you could have done something else. But maybe that example is a little controversial. Maybe you think kleptomaniacs have more control. So let's take a different example. Think about somebody with obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. He washes his hands constantly, and he tells you he does it because he feels an overwhelming urge to wash his hands. It's also true, however, that if he had a different urge, say, not to wash his hands constantly, then he wouldn't be doing this. That means that the OCD victim is fully free on the compatibilist account. He's doing what he wants, and if he didn't want to do it, he wouldn't be doing it. Nonetheless, we don't want to say that he's fully free. His freedom seems compromised in an important way. But the classical compatibilist account can't explain why this individual's free will is somehow less full, less rich than people who don't suffer from those kinds of conditions. In the next lecture, we'll see a contemporary compatibilist account that seems to solve all of these problems by providing a more sophisticated view about how desires are involved in decision-making in humans.